Okay, so we start. It's a very small group. The session is going to be streamed. I know that my team is watching us, so let's behave. Today we are talking about the need for integrating and coordinating system planning, because in order to combat climate change, we need to build massive amount of energy infrastructures, in particular solar, wind, and electricity grids, but also much more. And of course, any piece of energy that we build, it is built in nature next to people, and of course, it has impacts. It is our task, and everyone's task, to make sure that there are no impacts in nature, but rather, I would argue, we use this massive transformation of our economies and our energy system as an opportunity to also restore nature that, as you all know, not only we have a climate crisis, but we also have a biodiversity crisis. By tackling them together, we may find more sustainable and long-term solutions. So I pass the word to Jörg Andrea Krüger. He's president of NABU. NABU is the German branch of BirdLife. And Jörg, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, and a friendly welcome from my side as well. I'm really happy to be here and have the opportunity to share some of our thoughts about the topic here, since it is one of the topics which is the most and widely discussed topics in our organization for the last 10 to 15 years. Maybe for information, we are a large organization working with volunteers. We have actually currently 70,000 volunteers in more or less 2,000 local groups. And that means we are linked to civil society in more or less each part of the civil society. And that is good time then for discussions with all parts of the society. Climate protection and biodiversity conservation are two sides of the same coin. Sentences like this we hear nowadays more and more often, also from politicians, but the meaning is often unclear. Yes, the climate crisis is or will become one of the main drivers of species loss, and yes, healthy ecosystems are natural carbon sinks, and we need them really for our fight against climate change. But building up infrastructure for renewables and grids can have massive negative impacts on ecosystem and population of species. And I mean, this conflict is obvious and well described in tons of studies. So my first message is, don't pretend that there is no conflict. It's important to be very clear about that. For us in NABU, and I guess in many other nature conservation organizations, it is very bitter. For decades, we have been fighting for healthy ecosystems, and now we have to accept and even ask for additional pressure on nature for their long-term protection. But we all know that there are solutions to minimize negative impacts and sometimes to build up renewables and grids and improve biodiversity within one step. In a first step, we should follow always two general principles to limit negative impacts and produce renewable energies in a nature-compatible way. These are, for sure, choose the least harmful source. And the best example for that is to avoid, for example, building mega dams like we knew from the Amazon, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, and other rivers for hydropower. These dams often destroy the ecology of a river system completely, and fortunately it is now cheaper to produce the same amount of energy with solar parks. The second is identify the best, the least conflicting place for a project. Analyze the ecological sensitivity at the beginning. We have very good experiences with spatial plans in which the least sensitive areas are selected. We therefore take a very critical view of the current discussions in Germany and the European Union on weakening the spatial planning legislation, and we see the risk that we will have more conflicting places and sites which are developed for projects. At the end, this sounds so far so simple, but we all know that we will need much more space for renewable energies within the next decade, and that there are not enough low-conflict locations. I'm convinced that we must move from the just nature-compatible to a nature-positive renewables. Especially wind farms and solar parks will be a normal part of landscapes. There are not single projects anymore, some small dots on a landscape. There are new and additional land use systems in parallel to agriculture, for example, and we should address the potential for being nature-positive at systemic level. How could that work? I just have the time only for two brief ideas. The first is an area of wind farm is very often located in arable land, and the landowner, the farmer, gets a fee for the windmills on his land. We should create benefits for nature by combining that income with activities like the change from conventional to ecological farming without synthetic pesticides, or with using 10% of the area of the farm for nature conservation, e.g. as an area for insects. In a solar park, it's even easier to create additional value for nature. For at least 20 years, there will be no fertilizers and pesticides on it, and we can use them as a part for the connection between different protected areas through the landscape. The first biodiversity solar parks are already existing for a couple of years, and the results are phenomenal. We can build green infrastructure with solar parks. For this, we need a good overview of what the main problems for biodiversity are in the respective landscape, and for sure we need money for the additional investment in a fair share of money from the public and the private. There are still many open questions around that. So who is paying for that? To which extent will it become an obligation? But I'm convinced that including biodiversity it is necessary for the expansion of renewable energy sources, and Europe needs to be here a leading example. Discussions like this one today will help us to build the right systems. For my end, and as a final remark, it's a kind of important last disclaimer. Renewables, no matter whether nature compatible or nature positive, can't be expanded without limits. We must use energy much more efficient and save more energy than we do today if we really want to protect ecosystems and climate together. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we will have a really good discussion.
Thank you very much, Jörg. And to make things a bit more complicated, I would like to remind that we not only need to build solar and wind to decarbonize our economies, but we need to build also grids. And grids are also a threat to biodiversity and definitely a threat to many birds. Still, there are ways to handle these threats, and it is our duty to find the solutions to do both. I now move to Ivan Ramirez. He is head of avian team at the Convention on Migratory Species, and he will give us an overview of the project he is dealing with.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Well, I think that, first of all, thank you for having us, the CMS Convention, in this panel. I had some slides, but I think I will just go through it. I think that the main idea that I wanted to transmit here is the experience of the CMS Energy Task Force, so I will give you a bit of an overview about the work that we do and what do we think can be done to make sure that sustainable planning actually works towards migratory species, which is our focus. So a couple of notes on who we are. The Convention on Migratory Species is the only global UN treaty dealing with migratory species at global level. It's 133 countries already being part of the convention, plus the European Union, who is actually a full party. And we are the only global treaty focusing on migratory species, birds, mammals, aquatic species, and so on. And I'm really fond of saying that what we created, the Energy Task Force, which is created thanks to a mandate given by the parties, is a successful model of cooperation. And when we mean cooperation, we mean actually all different stakeholders. We do have parties, we have countries from all over the globe, We have secretariats from other MEAs. We have Ramsar, we have CBD, we have AIWA, we have Eurobats. We have industry, so that's energy producers. We have also NGOs and academia who are providing the data. And we have observers such as the IUCN or basically all the international finance institutions and banks, sovereign banks as well. And the way that we are doing is assessing the threats or the potential threat that energy has through flyways. We are part of the avian team, as we said, and we think that flyways, so those are the corridors that birds are using globally, are the perfect example on how to promote international cooperation. Sorry? No. That's okay, yeah. So basically what we are trying to do is to use flyways to promote international cooperation. And we think this is basically needed for two reasons. One, because it gives to think out of the box and think out of a national border. And many, many times we are seeing that countries are too focused on their own grid and on their own power station and not thinking about the species that are actually crossing across. And also because they are threatened. I mean, we are a convention that focuses on threatened species. And to give you an example, in the Mediterranean or in the Middle East, 40% of the migrants are declining. 40% of the migrants. And that's, hundreds of species declining. And the second part of my talk, once I justify why we think we need such cooperation, is destroying some myths, if I might say. And I think, also what I'm hearing a lot in terms of those myths is like industry will say that academia doesn't want to cooperate with them, or countries will say that they cannot access the data. I think to an extent this is a bit of a myth, because we do know that data is available. There is a lot of, especially for bird taxa, there is a lot of data available done through NGO networks and academia. We do know that governments actually need data, and they're happy to receive this data. And we do know that international finance mechanisms are eager to have this data and do their best possible planning before they are granting a project. So I think that what we really miss is sometimes time and the capacity to sit together and discuss, and this is what the Energy Task Force is trying to do. What we are trying to also have is an engagement protocol for all the governments to understand how to work with the finance mechanisms, and also for the NGOs to understand how to communicate and how to transfer the data to the governments. And last but not least, to make sure that there is a central repository of data where they can find this information. This is vital, because sometimes we feel that although there is willingness to cooperate, they don't know where to find the information. So some of the solutions that the ATF is proposing, for example, are simple things, like having a list of experts per country. So if you are a finance mechanism or if you are a government, you know where to find who are the local experts for migratory birds or for migratory mammals. If you are an energy producer, you know what is the best practice that other countries have done in terms of deploying solar PV, for example, or wind farms. This is how we are trying to do it. And I think it's been a successful model. So my final message is really a bit of a positive one, and mentioning that from my point of view, from the point of view of the CMS, we need to try to avoid this dichotomy between deciding what is best to protect the nature, to protect biodiversity, or to meet the Paris Agreement in terms of CO2 and energy. I think that both go together. This is not a trade-off. If energy developments are well planned, they will have to consider nature, otherwise they shouldn't go ahead. But it is possible actually to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Oh, Ivan. I think Ivan. Yeah, Ivan. Yeah. So I think I can agree fully that we need to do both. I already said this. However, doing it both, it's not easy. And actually, I would like to move to our next speaker, Jutta Paulus. She is a member of the European Parliament, representing the Greens. Jutta, so how do we do it both? Because we have energy collaborations, we have environmental collaborations, we have energy policies, but we do not really have energy and climate and environmental collaborations bound together. And very often there is a conflict of interest among ministries on who has the say. The European Union has put forward a very strong package to accelerate the speed of both renewables and electricity grids, and has put on the table a number of measures that are highly controversial among the conservation community. So how do we reconcile, and what can policymakers and governments do to make sure that we tackle the multiple challenges that we have and reach all the goals that we have set for ourselves?
Thank you very much for organizing this panel, and thank you very much for having me. And actually, I also have some, let's say, general messages. And the first message is, do not downplay the effect of fossil fuels. Of course, everyone knows that burning fossil fuels contributes to climate change, very much so. But there are also other effects, like mercury. The source of mercury, the biggest source of mercury is the burning of coal. The biggest source of particulate matter is the burning of fossil fuels. And these are also impacting nature. These are also harming animals, plants, bacteria even. So this is something that sometimes gets a bit lost in the debate, that aside from the climate crisis, there are pollution issues which also affect nature and not only human health. We are also always talking about human health, about lung diseases, about strokes, cardiovascular diseases, but why do we actually believe that nature is not affected by this? Of course it is. So I think we should keep this in mind, and we should also use this argumentation whenever someone comes with this argument, well, nature is so much impacted by renewables. Well, nature is impacted by fossil fuels also. The second message, you have already said it, spatial planning is key. And we see this especially when it comes to the ocean, because there we have a lot of overlapping uses of the same maritime areas. We want to set aside land or sea for offshore wind parks. At the same time, there's the fishery. We want to have marine protected areas. And we should do this, of course, in a way that we are actually taking into account the facts. Because it doesn't make sense to set up a marine protected area for certain birds if the migratory route doesn't go there, or to build a wind park where there is a migratory route of certain birds. So we should really reflect this together, and this has to be also done cross-border, because if Germany is doing its planning, Denmark is doing its planning, Norway is the UK is Belgium, Netherlands, and these don't fit together, then at the end of the day, everyone loses. So I think we should really take care that we are doing the spatial planning in a comprehensive way, taking all stakeholders on board and finding the best solution for everyone. Because I think it is very clear that we will need more offshore wind parks, despite I'm fighting for more efficiency in the Energy Efficiency Directive. But we cannot just go forward with everyone's first ideas. And you said it also, if it's smartly done, renewable energy and grid planning can be done in a nature-positive way. I was yesterday at the event where there was a memorandum of understanding signed between the Nature Conservancy and Eurelectric, bringing together nature conservation, nature protection, NGO, and the electricity producers and grid operators, who committed themselves to building their infrastructure in a nature-positive way and taking advice from those that are actually working on nature protection. And I think this is the way forward, to work with each other and not against each other, to get out of each other's trenches and to look how can we achieve the best. And Jörg, you already said biodiversity-friendly solar parks are nature positive if you compare it to intensive agriculture. So at the end of the day, both can win if we plan smartly. Third message, irrespective of renewable energy, nature is at risk. And I really hope that we will get a Paris moment in Montreal next month when there is the COP15 on biodiversity, because we really urgently need it. And we need strong targets, we need strong governance and reliable finance in the EU nature restoration law, which is right now negotiated at the European Union's level. It's the first law of its kind. There is no blueprint for that. And right now, it's a bit lacking teeth. We are missing strong indicators. We are missing good monitoring. We are missing reliable finance. The targets for specific ecosystems have to be improved, so I will be working on this in the European Parliament. But we already see a lot of opposition to this restoration law. And right now, it's also nature protection and restoration, as you said, is not streamlined. So on the one hand, we have good environmental laws in the European Union, but on the other hand, we have the common agricultural policy, the common fishery policy, which has no good effect on nature. We have really scientific facts up to the ceiling which show that these are not reaching their goals, and even the European Court of Auditors laid it out quite nicely, showing that the climate spending, the biodiversity spending, which is supposed to be happening in the CAP, doesn't work. And
I want to ask a question,
Yeah.
because you talked about spatial planning and marine spatial planning, which is obviously a very important element for allocating space. But up to now, the spatial planning does not allocate space for nature, and spatial planning, the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, for example, but also spatial planning exercises that are done around Europe and in many other countries, do not use sensitivity maps. So at the end of the day, we do a planning that it is kind of handicapped because we have not allocated space for nature, and we have done the planning without the information that would be essential to put technology in a certain area. So how can we overcome this, and how can we move into a more robust planning?
I wouldn't agree if you say there is no space for nature in the spatial planning, because we already have protected areas which are sensitive areas. I mean, this is a fact. You cannot deny that we have the Natura 2000 network covering, I think, 18% of the European landscape. And in the restoration law, we are even, the Commission's proposal says that the member states should set aside 20% of their land and sea area for restoration purposes. So there is already a mapping, but you're totally right. It lacks a proper monitoring, it lacks implementation, it lacks management plans. So legislation is not the problem, enforcement is the problem. And I'm stepping constantly on European Commission's toes saying, hey, you have to do more on actually be the guardian of the treaties, be the guardian of environmental law. And although the most infringement procedures, an infringement procedure means the European Commission looks at what a member state is doing in a certain respect, whether it's in line with European law, and if it's not, it starts first with a nice letter, then with a not so nice letter, and at the end of the day, the member state might find itself at the European Court of Justice. But European Commission is much too slow on this, and they are only cherry-picking the most contested cases, so to speak. They are not looking at the smaller ones because they say, we don't have the resources for that. And I'm like, well, then maybe reallocate your resources, because you're the Commission, right? So you can choose where you put your efforts. So my answer would be, you're right that we are lacking monitoring, implementation, enforcement, but in principle, we know where the sensitive areas are.
So in many countries, the protected areas are not fully designated. We need to allocate more space and time is probably one of the resources that we lack most. Definitely, we need to do more on that. I will come back to that, to the other speakers, but now I want to bring in Rob MacDonald, who is the Managing Director for Transmission at the Scottish and Southern Energy Company. Rob, do you think that environmental law is slowing down the deployment? And would you like to scratch it, or rather you want to work with these guys and to find the solutions that are needed? So from the industry side, do you find environmental laws as a burden or maybe even as an incentive to do things better?
No, we don't find it a burden. Actually, I find myself in very strong agreement with the rest of the panel, which might be a little boring for the discussion, but is the case. Look, if I maybe give some context first, just to explain where I'm coming from. So I look after the transmission system in the north of Scotland. We are facing huge growth. I'm part of the wider SSE group, looking to spend £25 billion sterling in the next 7 or 8 years delivering on net zero. What that means for my business in transmission in the north of Scotland is huge growth. If you look at the Climate Change Committee's, the UK Climate Change Committee's projections for how we're going to achieve net zero in the UK, fully 10% of that needs to come from renewables connected just to my network for all of our CO2 emissions. So that's a huge contribution. And what that means in generation terms is we're going to have to go from an 8 gigawatt generation system today to 15 gigawatts by the middle of the decade, i.e. nearly double, and about 24 gigawatts by the end of the decade, so treble the system. So there's no two ways about it. That's a lot of new infrastructure, that's a lot of construction. To answer your direct question, Antonella, no, I don't think the environmental laws are getting in the way of that. Quite the opposite. I agree with the comments that have been made from fellow panellists. I like the point about planning grids can be done in a nature positive way. And the way we've approached that as a company is by doing three things. Firstly, we've committed, and it's an absolute commitment, that all of our projects will have no biodiversity net loss, and we're looking to, and we have in fact committed to get in a position that by 2025 we'll be in a net gain position for all of our projects, a 5% net gain. And that's a firm commitment that we will be judged against and which is independently verified. The second thing that we do is in terms of woodlands, it's a fact of life, unfortunately, that you can't have trees next to power lines, so we do have to cut down a number of trees. And we've got a replanting program, so we replant for every tree that we take down, and we work in tandem with a third party, the Argyll Countryside Trust, who look after that for us. And thirdly, we are very sensitive in our route selection. I really liked Jürgen's two principles, and I hope I wrote this down correctly, but best, least conflicting place. That's a pretty good description of what we tried to do, working with our stakeholders. I think we have to be adult and grown up about this. There are conflicts. There are conflicts as to cost, there are conflicts as to speed, there are conflicts with nature, and there are other conflicts. And we, to my mind, the key to navigate a path through that is firstly transparency and an honest conversation about those trade-offs to find the best possible solution, all against the backdrop that as a portfolio we will hit a biodiversity net gain situation. So I find myself in agreement with most of what the panel said this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's nice to hear some singing. It's not birds singing, but yeah. So let's continue. Rob, representing the industry, and I know a lot of industry actors that actually share your same opinion. It is possible, and there is commitment to reduce impacts, and nevertheless, it's not easy. And very often, I want to go back to Utah because I know that you need to be going soon. We observe that there is a very strong emphasis to energy security. A lot of decisions are taken. Some of them are very stupid, some others are very good. But how do we make sure that in this moment of energy crisis is a global energy crisis. Really, we do not forget that nature has to be tackled at the same time. President Biden has announced a huge amount, a very large package for nature restoration in the US with a global outreach. This is good, but generally, a lot of the discussion that is done at state level, government of states and prime ministers, is about energy and not about biodiversity. How can we change this?
That's a tricky question, actually, because that's what I'm constantly asking myself. How can we make it clear to, let's say, the broader public that without biodiversity there is no clean air, there is no drinkable water, there is no fertile soil, there is no food, which are really the basic necessities, apart from the energy overconsumption which we are doing in the global north. So I think what's crystal clear, regardless what the EU or member states write down in their legislation, they cannot overturn the Aarhus Convention, right? So the Aarhus Convention still holds true. Of course, there is legal access also for groups like BirdLife or others to proceed against something that violates environmental law. And the overriding public interest doesn't mean that you're simply allowed to do everything. I think a member state who does it smartly by saying, okay, let's look, where are our sensitive areas, not only the one that are already within the Natura 2000 network, but maybe also others, and let's do the planning at sites outside those sensitive areas, of course, but also at sites with high yield. Because frequently what I'm hearing from people, well, don't build it here, build it over there. I'm like, well, but you would have to put up 5 wind turbines there for one single over here because the yield is so different. So I think this also has to be taken into account because regardless of the position, 5 turbines is always more impact than 1, right? Simply because of material use. So basically what we need is to bring all stakeholders to the table. And I think that's always true when it goes about land use. And overriding public interest, to say it again, it means you have to look at alternatives if you want to go through sensitive areas. But if you haven't checked on alternatives, then the court will stop you. It's as simple as that.
I'm going to ask a very nasty question. Are you going to lead in removing Article 11 of the Common Fishery Policy? Because Article 11 is somehow preventing nature protection at sea.
I must admit, as I'm not in the PESH committee, not working on fishery, I don't even know the text of Article 11.
So I'm going to explain. Article
in
11,
I would say yes.
Yeah, Article 11 basically, if a country, let's say the Netherlands, because this is what the Netherlands has been trying to do right now, try to allocate protected areas in the Dutch sea space as part of the REACH offshore program. So allocated space for offshore wind, grids, and nature. And in this protected area, bottom trawling would be forbidden. But because of Article 11, the Dutch vessels may not go there, but all the other member states' vessels can go and bottom trawl that area. And this is it is heartbreaking. So we need to get rid of that. And I think that in this current situation where we know we need to build a massive amount of energy infrastructure and replace coal, oil, and also nuclear, then we need also to pick other users of the space. And so we will need to make choices and understand which activity should be allowed and which should be kicked out. And this is a difficult discussion.
I would happily draw on Article 11 at the deepest point of the channel or somewhere else, because that doesn't make sense. I mean, that's a total... I don't know who ever thought of this, and I'm surprised that everyone seems to be fine with it.
Yeah, maybe just to add there, I mean, that is it's a long-term discussion which we had around Article 11, and especially about the bottom trawling in all the protected areas of the North Sea. It is more or less no movement in the last 5 or 10 years, which we had seen in the debate coming from the member states and the European Commission. So it would be really good when we come a step forward there. And I'm happy to hear that you will be on our side.
So I want to go back to Ivan, because you are dealing with migratory species. We do have migratory species on land and at sea. This requires, their protection requires international agreements. And very often these international agreements are not fully implemented. They may be on paper, but the implementation is hard. At the same time, you see this massive amount of energy being deployed. Plants are higher than the reality, but still there is a lot of movement. How do you think we can indeed do both? You said if it's dangerous, we should not do it, but climate change is also a big danger to biodiversity. So striking a bit the right middle of preventing climate change impacts that are going to be irreversible, the impacts of energy infrastructure, and keeping biodiversity rich.
Thanks, and good question. So two points to answer. One is about the migratory species you mentioned, avian and aquatic, definitely. Actually, it's funny. I mean, it's interesting because 2 weeks ago we organized one of the first webinars where we were discussing not just the avian species, but the aquatic species, migratory species, and how to take into account their data, because data for migratory aquatic species is much less abundant than for avian species, but we're working on this, and there are many groups of researchers and academia that are working with this. So how do we address this? You know, you mentioned I think you mentioned when developments are dangerous. I think language is important. I mean, developments are either nature positive, or they are going to incorporate nature on them, or they are not. But if it is dangerous, meaning that it's going to have an impact, a negative impact on a migratory species, for us that would be something that it is not good to go. But there are solutions to that. I mean, I was this morning in another session where actually here in Egypt there is a lot of experience about wind farms that are being located just in the middle of a migration corridor, but they are using such on demand. They are avoiding, collision with migratory species. But not only that, they are actually applying modeling, trying to understand when the migration peaks are going to happen. So they are being, let's say, preemptive in terms of avoiding these classes. So this is a typical scenario where you have a wind farm on a location that you may think could be dangerous, but actually it is not being dangerous because they know how to use them at the right moment. So when it's a migration peak, simply they are not working. That's what I mean when I say that the planning needs to start from the beginning. For that, you need sensitivity mapping, you need to have the information, you need to have best practice. You need to make sure that you expand and you promote that elsewhere, because the experience that they have here in Egypt is something that they don't have in many other countries, and they need to know. But it is possible. It is possible to have a massive development in terms of wind farms in the middle of one of the hotspots of migration and still not having a negative impact on the species. That's the way to do it.
Very good. So I actually believe that it is possible and we have to do it. I'm aware that you will be leaving in 4 minutes, so I will give you the word one more time and then I move to Rob. I'm afraid I'm going to repeat myself. 2 more days of COP, you will go back in the European Parliament. What Europe does is important for the rest of the world. How do we show leadership in this topic? Europe has tried to show leadership in climate policies with, I would say, mixed results, up and down, just to be fair. But now we need to show leadership in really showcasing solutions. Because we cannot believe in targets only. We need to believe in facts. And so what can Europe do to give confidence that it is indeed possible to do what Ivan just told us?
I think 2 things would be relevant. First, to really publish good guidelines on how to build nature-positive renewable energy plants and also how to do nature-positive grid expansion. This is something where the Commission could just publish guidelines. I mean, that doesn't even have to be a law. If there is a guideline, you will find out very, very quickly that the authorities are referring to European guidelines, even if those are not enshrined in law. We are seeing this frequently also in other issues, that if there are guidelines, then the authorization process says, well, you have to adhere to those guidelines, right? And secondly, really, we need a strong nature restoration law. And just as a side note, people tend to think restoration means rewilding. And yes, rewilding is one form of restoration, but some of our most biodiversity-rich ecosystems are semi-natural ones. For example, you would never find a natural orchard somewhere where you have a beautiful meadow with some apple trees, some pear trees, some cherry trees. This will not happen by itself, but it is a hugely biodiverse feature in the landscape. So restoration measure does not mean that the land cannot be used by anyone, but it means that the ecosystem service, the ecosystem thrives through a different use which puts much less pressure on the land. And as it's really my pet project, I would like to point out that if we do not achieve the targets that the Commission put in the restoration law, which are still far too low in restoring our peatlands and wetlands, we will not be able to reach our climate goals, because those are extremely carbon-rich, highly biodiverse, extremely valuable ecosystems, and they also should be left out of any measures like foundations for wind parks or something. I know that there are some research going on whether a partial shading with solar panels could maybe help the peatland because less water evaporates, but I think we should be extremely careful. And this is one of my pet projects, as I said, protect and restore European peatlands, and don't look only at agriculture, but also at forestry, because most of our peatlands are actually drained for forestry use, especially in the northern member states. And this is true for the whole world. Like, we have this belt of peatlands in the northern hemisphere, also in Canada, also in Russia. And there we really have to take care that this carbon bomb doesn't explode.
So thanks a lot. Of course, I'm a bit of an extreme in my position. I would like to see penalties. If we have polluters paying for carbon, they should also pay for destroying nature in the harshest way. But maybe I'll get in touch with you about this, another discussion. Rob, what would you think would make your colleagues be nature net positive in all their investments? What would be the key motivation for doing that? And not just being just within guidelines. By the way, there are guidelines already, but how can you do better and faster?
So I can only speak for my company, the decisions we've made. We made the decision to make the commitment to biodiversity net gain because we talked to our stakeholders and they were crystal clear that's what they wanted, and we talked to them about what that might cost and different things, and so there was an informed choice. And I'm clear in my mind, there is a conflict and lots of trade-offs, but I'm clear this has to be a core part of what we do because we're developing so much infrastructure. We're asking an awful lot of the local communities in which we operate. We cannot do that if we're going to be reckless, if I can use that word, with nature. It's just not going to pass muster. So to my mind, this all is part of the package, if I can use that phrase. We have to get that right, and that was a clear message we had from our stakeholders.
One more thing, you have a kind of monopoly, no? You don't have direct competitors, at least the grid operators are in a monopolistic type of business. Do you think that your approach is also true for the generation side, where it's a free competition market?
That's an interesting question. Actually, our renewables colleagues are launching a report in the UK Pavilion as we speak, making exactly the same commitment that we've made in transmission, because they think it's the right thing to do. If you look at generation, it's not a one-shot game, if I can use that phrase. We'll be applying for lots of schemes, working with lots of different communities. And I think if you're going to be successful over the long term, and we're a long-term business in both generation and transmission, you need to demonstrate you're doing the right thing and you're part of the community, and the biodiversity net gain to us is part of that commitment. There are other things we're doing as well, but that's part of that commitment. I think developers who want to make a quick buck short term, that's not a long-term business, and that's not what drives us.
So Jörg, do you believe Rob? And are you ready to work with the industry, somehow overcoming the bad experiences of the past, and there have been many, and also giving the trust that is needed for someone like Rob to act, knowing that there are also the bad guys out there?
Yes, for sure. I mean, what we see and what we recognize is that there is a change in industries, and that we have a lot of companies and a lot of actors which are really trusted discussion partners at the moment. And for sure in the future I can think about direct corporations or cooperation as a systemic level. So we have to find solutions which we can share together and we can bring forward together. That's I'm really convinced about. All these other things, all these separative ways and so on, we have to overcome. And the bad guys in the room, I don't think that we can wait on them and for them. That's something what we have to solve with regulation at the end. So the last 20% is always a question for regulation, for a strict one, for harsh penalties, as you suggested. So that's where we are at the moment. And I would really love to think a little bit more about how to gain net, or how to be net positive at the end, and to find that for all these different sources of renewables. It's not only wind, it's not only offshore, and we have so many connections to other land use systems. If I just bring into the room the question of how we use our arable land, what is about the biomass production, and if you know that you can have with a solar park around 50% more, 5 times higher, 50 times higher yield from the same area, and we have the food security discussion. So is it okay still to produce biomass for energy? I don't think so.
Well, I have been saying over and over again that we will find solutions in complexity and in not slicing down the problems we have. So for sure, I think that being nature net positive is an horizontal effort. But can you explain at which level you consider nature positivity? Do you consider it at project level, at regional level, or at ecosystem level?
We have to do it on all levels, for sure. And what I see in my mind map, my personal mind map, is that the restoration scheme is something what we have as a kind of development coming from the governments. We are looking for the most vulnerable ecosystems. I guess we will start in many countries with the marine ecosystems, with the forest ecosystems, with the peatland ecosystems, since these are the carbon-rich ecosystems and they are the highest and best carbon sinks. And what we have to find is a solution for the arable land, for the open landscape, where we find most of the wind farms, of the onshore wind farms and most of the solar parks.
And the grids.
And the grids for sure, and the biomass production. So, and that means we have to find solutions for these working in the open landscape. And there I see responsibility of the project developers and the project owners as well. And I say, each of these projects has to fit in a systematic approach to change or to become nature positive at a regional level at least.
Okay, but how do we do it, considering that people like Rob may be great in managing the electricity system, but their knowledge on ecosystem net positivity may be rather limited. My experience is that companies have developed very deep knowledge on certain area of biodiversity, sometimes even better than the NGO community or the conservation community, sorry. But it's very narrow, it's a very specific, which is linked to their own business. And so how do we bridge? Because what you are advocating for requires an ecosystem approach, which is very comprehensive, and that I do not expect energy companies to have it or to want to have it.
So, I will do first. Okay. I think what we have to have is, and you mentioned that, we have to have a good monitoring what happened in each of the regions, in the ecosystems. And then the regional council can develop their own spatial plans for ecosystems in their region. And so the energy developer or the project developer, they have a system where they can connect to. And as an implementation tool, I can think about maybe a voluntary industry standard. That would be one option. We can have a legally binding system that we say, okay, you as a project developer, you have to do this and this and this, or we develop only an additional finance mechanism. If you develop a wind farm, a solar park, in a landscape like this, you have to pay in a governmental fund so that the local, the regional district, the regional county can spend the money for the ecosystem restoration and the ecosystem positive things. So many things to discuss.
Okay, so to discuss, we need the different parties at the table, and we have already said this is necessary, and we will have to intensify this discussion. Before I pass the word to Ivan, one additional question to both of you. Energy infrastructure can actually do more than just delivering energy or transmitting energy or electricity. Have you been thinking about multifunctionality of infrastructure? Give you an example. The Italian grid operators has equipped the electricity pylons with fire detectors because there are a lot of forest fires. Thinking about putting cameras on subsea cable or buoys. How can we foster this multifunctionality? It's not multi-use of space, it's multifunctionality, it's a different concept, so that you can get more out of what you built.
Okay, happy to answer that. We're doing all of the above. So we're doing all of those where it makes commercial sense. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. You have to worry about resilience as well. And if you put all your telecommunications infrastructure and your electricity infrastructure in one place, that can be vulnerable. So you need to be careful about that. But where it commercially makes sense, we are doing all those things. Can I come back slightly to the question earlier about how do we deliver the biodiversity? I think there's a danger we can overcomplicate this because there are any amount of consultancies out there that will help you figure out, once you've decided that what you want to achieve, there are plenty of consultancies that will help you out. We're developing our own expertise because we've got so many projects, so that makes sense for us. It's pretty simple stuff. I mean, we're not, you know, when it gets down to it. And then we've also got partnerships. We had a partnership with the Bumblebee Conservation Trust at one of our substations at Thurso South, and they told us what we would need. And we've actually seen the great yellow bumblebee making a comeback on the back of an electricity substation. Who would have thought that was possible? And our partners just came in and said, this is what you need to do. And we brought a company and they went to do it. So there is the expertise there if we decide, we make the decision that that's what we want to do.
Ivan.
Well, I'm going back to the question, actually, because I think it's a great question, but I would say the answer is quite simple. This is where the regulator comes in, you know. I mean, if the set of rules and the steps are clear by the regulator, the European Commission, the European Union in the case of Europe, but if not, multilateral environmental agreements.
Not energy regulators.
Sorry?
Energy regulators?
Well, then you
because they don't have
it.
it.
Self-regulation. But what I mean is that, you know, sorry. You know, I don't think it's, let me say, fair for energy developers to already consider, you know, full ecosystem approaches, you know, going at international level. This is not fair to be asked to the developers. The regulator needs to have the data beforehand. The regulator needs to establish the set of steps so when they are making a proposal, they know, you know, what is the legislation saying and what is the type of data that they have to compile. And then, yes, there is an issue with data ownership. We are seeing it a lot in the Energy Task Force. There is a lot of data available from energy companies. There's a lot of data available from NGO sector and academia that it's not shared because of data ownership rights and because of different platforms not talking to each other, because of no common databases, and this is an issue. But this is where, again, you know, MEAs and governments need to talk to each other and actually make it available. But because there are tools, but it is not just putting every single effort in the case of the developers or in the case of the NGOs. I think this is where actually governments have a role to play.
Rob, are you sharing your data?
We share our data. I don't know if I'm allowed to comment on European laws anymore, as it been in the UK. But if you'll allow me, just once to answer the question. I think even understand the point. I think we've got to be a little bit careful, and you'd be at the same point about having lots of rules and very prescriptive regulations, because as the point Jürgen made, the solution might be very different at each individual site, and if we've got a very rigid, dogmatic set of rules, then we might get unintended consequences or get the wrong answers. So to me, it's about setting out what are the key objectives we want to deliver, biodiversity net gain, maybe some red lines about some things that are utterly intolerable. We set those out in the rules. We set a common set of rules for everybody, and then we hold people to account if they don't do them, but not being very prescriptive site by site by site, because I think it's very difficult to prescribe the right solution for nature. It would be very different, even within my own area, north of Scotland, let alone across Europe.
But what would you say? I mean, to prescribe the ways is the one maybe problematic approach, but to define the impact which has been reached for nature positivity after 10 years, that could be maybe a way where the government says, okay, you dear friends from the energy developing side, within 10 to 15 years we want to have this and this status in the ecosystems of population. It's your task to do that. We don't describe the ways. Do it. Would that work?
Well, I think that's what I'm setting out. That's effectively what a biodiversity net gain does. And if you've got a methodology so you can objectively measure whether that target has or hasn't been met, and you leave the developer to figure out the best, most cost-efficient way in conjunction with stakeholders, I think that's not usually told to speak up. I think that's a better way of doing it, rather than prescribing right across the whole of Europe or even within countries what each project needs to do, which I think will have unintended consequences.
Sorry, I think this is a very important conversation, because if you have rules that are too strict, in a certain way you kill innovation, and you may risk not to get your objective, but at the same time, if you set the objective to be in 10 years in the future, sorry Rob, some of the companies may be gone bankrupt by then, these days. So we need to have milestones measurable milestones all the way through. And we go back to data. Where do we get the data? So who should collect the data of the progresses that are being made? And personally, I think that we need to move into a more centralized data collection, because then we have common protocols. We can compare pairs with pairs and not pairs with pigs, as it is the case today, and increase the trust and reliability of the data. Traditionally, data has always been considered a competitive advantage by project developers. I think today, with the targets that we have, the need of building infrastructure faster and in quantities that the supply chains cannot really deliver in time, data is better shared than kept in a drawer. And so how do we really develop a continental scale data collection protocol, data monitoring protocol, and a full transparency on data? And maybe, Jörg, you also have a good idea of who should be administering this data.
The only thing what I can say is that we had these discussions recently in Germany, and they are now developments like a governmental monitoring center for all the biodiversity data, completely new developed, dozens of scientists working on that. And I can think about bringing that together with a European-wide approach, where from each country we have a kind of standardized monitoring center where they collect the data at the national level and then bring them together for the European level, so that we have bioregional or continental solutions.
So the European Union has already created EMONNet for sea data. It's not perfect, but I think it's one effort, a relevant effort, to ingest data from different actors. It's not working the way it should, and environmental data is still a minor element of that. But of course, it could be a template to be fixed.
Very quickly to say, I mean, I was involved in the past in long discussions on creating databases at European level, and they rarely work because of data ownership and because of the systems, even just the software systems. I haven't lost faith that actually this is needed, and I know that people in the European Union believe the same, and also at global level or other organizations, but I think we shouldn't be too idealistic about this. I think the key problem from my point of view is really sharing what we have available when the time comes. So in many occasions you do have a project development at a place, you know, in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, where actually data is available, but people know it's too late in time for actually, you know, have it sent, you know what I mean? So it's more about sharing in the early stages of the planning more than creating this monster database that it's really difficult to manage. Because we've seen it. I mean, we've seen it in Ethiopia, for example, you know, simple things like such as pole design, something that many countries do actually know how to do it to avoid conflicts with wildlife. They weren't aware of this. They weren't aware, and they designed the whole transmission lines the wrong way, simply because they were not aware of the proper guidance. So, you know, sometimes a simple solution is easy.
A very nasty question. Should we ask Google maybe to do sensitivity maps and get all the data and put it on Google Maps and we have it there? Would you trust Google or Meta or whatever they are called these days to deal with this type of data?
I think that is a really complex and additional discussion, but you mentioned one of the key words of the discussion, and that's trust. And we very often have the discussion that people don't give their data since they don't trust the others. So maybe it's for competitive reasons between industry players, but as well from the NGO and expert side, that they say, don't want to share my data, that is what I have developed, it's mine. and I don't trust the people what they do. They will build streets across to my protected areas, and so on and so on. So trust building, I guess, is the first exercise which we have in mind, which we have to have in mind when we want to be successful, bringing the different interests together. Since otherwise we will all sit on our data and we don't trust, and we will not come together.
Rob, do you use sensitivity mapping?
Yes, we do, and looking to do it increasingly, actually. One of the things that we're looking at the moment, just starting to use, is AI to develop route selection. Just given the scale of the growth that we've got, getting a human to plan routes is not so efficient. But we're acutely aware that in doing that, you have to be very careful, because the algorithm will work out the right solution depending on what parameters you put in, on what things you value or don't value. And so we're aware of two things. Firstly, we're trialing that to see if it means some more efficient solutions and better outcomes. And secondly, we're working with the software company that has the IP for this, that has an independent user group that's consulting on what should those parameters be, because I think if the AI is to be trusted, it has to have some legitimacy and some transparency in the parameters that are deemed to be important, and then the AI works it out. But this is a very powerful tool. We used it on a wind farm connection recently for a route selection job that would take about 8 weeks to figure out the right route. And we did it in 4 weeks, and we ran 1.5 million simulations, which obviously you couldn't do if you had a human doing that. So this is a really powerful tool, and I think that can help with the problem we have before us.
Another nasty question. Do you use sensitivity mapping at grid planning level? You do your grid planning for the next 10 years at least? And do you transpose sensitivity maps at that level, or not at all, because it is too, well, it's not granulated enough?
It's not really granular enough, and it's obvious to us there are some kind of no-go areas in the grid, and so areas where we just know we will just not, that we can't go there. But other than that, it's not granular enough, and I think to have a meaningful conversation with stakeholders, you have to have it at that granular level, and including specific line routes, and be able to say, look, it's going from there to there, and this is what it would involve. Otherwise, the questions you're asking of stakeholders are too vague, and that, I think, risks people feeling they're not fully involved or misled or what have you. So I think it has to be done at a project level.
Jörg, there's been an increasing discussion about population versus individuals, or rather, individuals versus populations. How do you convince your members that have been very strongly protected individuals to move into a population? And do you agree with that, or is it completely wrong?
That is really a long discussion. So first, species protection always address the population level. The protection of individuals is an animal welfare question. But I mean, for sure, in the line of the European regulations, we have to be careful with handling the individuals of especially endangered species. That makes sense. And when it comes to the discussion at the local level about a wind farm, I can always understand that my volunteers, or the volunteers of NABU, are really critical about that. I mean, they sometimes fought for 30 years for the protected area, or for a forest, or for a specific quality of the landscape, and then especially there, this one red kite or black stork is endangered by a wind farm, mostly by a wind farm project. So what we need is really to bring the population in a good ecological status at the end, so that we always can say, okay, the population is not in danger anymore. And that is what we miss mostly for many populations. We have the situation that ecosystems are under pressure, that forests are under pressure, that populations are not in a good shape and a good status, and now we introduce energy as a new kind of land use system. And that causes all these conflicts at the local level with these emotional link for the people. And I can completely understand, and it's always a lot of discussion to convince them, okay, for the sake of the bigger picture, here we have to accept the wind farm. and we will make sure that the population of this and the species come to a better or to a good environmental status. That, I guess, is the only solution.
Yeah, very little to add from my side. I mean, if you ask me, as CMS, the criteria is very clear. You know, Appendix 1, globally threatened, no take permitted. So if they are going to be threatened by energy development, then it should stop. Appendix 2, you know, it means that international cooperation actually will prevent the species to collapse. So this is the typical case, you know. Definitely the population is the level. I mean, individual animals can suffer, but you have to have the whole picture. So whenever we are being, I mean, by the way, before you mentioned, you know, how do we stop it and what are the tools? Well, MEAs such as, you know, we do have compliance mechanisms. NGOs can use compliance mechanisms under the CMS or AIWA or Eurobats or any other and submit a complaint because governments are not fulfilling their obligations through CMS. This is another way. If we receive the case and we see there is an impact at population level, then we should elevate the case to a scientific committee, you know, and that's a way to operate. But it has to be the global picture. It cannot be just one or two individuals.
Good. So, population. Very good. Again, data. We go back to data, because if we don't have the data, then...
and implementation. I mean, we have these targets for a long, long time.
Yes, implementation, I think, is one of the weakest points these days. On paper, it looks fantastic, but in reality, we need to do much, much better. I personally believe that we will not get away of this dire situation and crisis without a new way of collaborating across sectors. We need to build trust, we need to bring people together and find the courage to test new solutions. And also leadership towards all members, towards own employees and shareholders, because actually doing all of this, it's not straightforward. You can be beheaded by your members and you can be beheaded by shareholders. It goes so quickly. And still, we need to find a way to work together. So how do we do it? And you have the last chance to solve all the problems of this world before dinner.
So, look, I won't repeat all that I said, Antonella. I think, to me, it's about making that big upfront commitment. Once you make the big commitment to biodiversity net gain, that forces you to do it. And we've talked a lot about data and enforcement, about transparency. I think the best point I can make is that this is happening. What I'm talking about is not something we're going to do, it's something we are doing today. I've got a site in Airlith. It's a substation that's under construction. It's a huge construction project. It will cost about £90 million sterling. It's about 18 football pitches in size. That is tracking a 60% biodiversity net gain currently. It also has, Evan, you'll be pleased to know, it has we had an osprey a few years ago that nested on one of our electricity towers, which wasn't great for the osprey, wasn't great for the tower either. So we've built a special bespoke tower, and in the last 6 years the birds have not only migrated there, but have breeded, and the local school kids named them. So the point I'm making is, this isn't theoretical, this is not some commitment. Talk about transparency, you can see it on our website, and if the rest of the panel are ever in Scotland, I'd be delighted to show it you, and we can continue the conversation over a glass of whiskey.
Oh.
Well, I hope you will join Renewables Grid Initiative. You would fit very well, and we would be delighted to have you there. Before I move to the others, is there anyone who wants to ask something? Yes. Then, do we have a microphone? The microphone is coming.
Hi. Hello. Is that clear? Okay. I work with Nature Conservation Egypt. We partner with BirdLife to help conserve the migration of birds. And we currently work on mitigating the high voltage power lines, shut off on demand for wind turbines. But I know for sure that, at least for Egypt, we still have plans as a country to expand these infrastructures. It's inevitable and it's crucial. And I was wondering, Mr. Yok, I think, yes, you said that you try and compensate cutting trees for the sake of power lines by partnering with a third party that does that for you. I was wondering, like, is it possible that we as humans soon will have some kind of reference that is also geographically specific, of course, that says, you as a company, if you want to build, I don't know, like a solar panel or a high voltage power line or a wind turbine somewhere specifically on the planet, you have to compensate it by doing specifically that, and not in a funding specification, but rather in a biodiversity credit or a specific effect. Because if we're talking about funding will change, economy will change. If we say pay $1,000 for a tree, that will change. The environment itself will change. Is there a way that we might soon have such a reference so these companies will just know what they're doing? They will know, if I build a tower here, I am going to do specifically that to compensate it, rather than say pay X euros and it might just go to waste.
Thanks a lot. This is a fantastic question. We collect the questions, if it's fine with you, and then we do a final wrap-up.
Yes, thank you. My name is Mamun Kakvilov. I am from Greens Movement of Georgia and Friends of the Earth Georgia, representing them. And I'm very much now inclined. I joined recently this organization, and I'm now believing now in the climate justice thing they are they're demonstrating for. And thank you for this fascinating discussion. Every phrase you said really resonated and clinged with our thinking. But one of the words were the international funding institution, Mr. Ivan mentioned. And what does not work? Because let me tell you the small story from Georgia. So we just joined, because of association agreement, the emerald sites. It's like a Natura 2000. So we talk about the population, yeah, not a single species. So there is a Turkish company with the Georgian, you know, the presence, the local the branch, their local branch. They are building the wind farm on top of the, ironically, Egyptian vulture, the habitat. And we know that EBRD is behind the project. So they are not officially in the process because they wait before the national, you know, the procedures will end and then they will appear. Probably, we don't know. We asked in the court, so we cannot go further in disputing. And Mr. York, we very much want to propose those kind of solutions. Let's talk about alternatives. Let's talk about the normal impact assessment. Let's do the decent job. We can give you the advice, you know, the free. Actually, I also very much like that there are consultants there who can really advise this. And maybe you cannot find them in Georgia, find them elsewhere, you know. And we lost the case in the court. So most probably they will proceed. I hope this will not be EBRD. And I then discovered that EBRD does not have even the, let's say that they can build in the protected area or in the emerald site in principle. So I was really surprised. I thought like this is the no-go area. They can go and build the hydropower there. They are building, for instance, in Larsi hydropower, if you would like to specific example, the Kazbeki National Park. And another is that they don't do the scoping. Now even Georgia is doing the scoping. We did not have this procedure, but because of the association agreement, EU directives, we implemented them. Now our legislation is better than EBRD's. So it's even a joke. So what is missing there? So why it doesn't work? So they are not even in the European Union now.
Thank you very much.
So,
yes.
Thank you.
So, please.
We have time for another one?
Yeah, we take it and then we respond.
All right, okay. Thanks, that was a really, really engaged panel. I'm glad I stayed back despite the late hour. I have a comment. It's it's not a criticism. It's just a thought that if because migratory birds from Europe, I'm from Pakistan, they actually come all the way to Pakistan and they go back. And RE grids and the expansion right now is a major. It's being pushed forth because the NDCs that Pakistan is committed to, and this is one factor that just does not play a role. And the fact that there's interconnection at that level, it would have been really nice to have, well, not a brown voice, but a voice from particularly those channels which cover and cut across those continents, just to see what happens if the conversation gets, gets complexed at that level. So that's one, just a thought, a comment. But another thought I had, which is a question particularly, is in Pakistan, the problem with some of the RE additions is that they can only happen on land that is owned by the government. And this is primarily because the World Bank and others have advised this way. These are highly land intensive, solar and wind. And wind, of course, offshore or onshore, again, is only spaces that are owned by governments. And so there are provincial issues there because provinces are very protective about their resources. And you cannot go and proceed against private parties. That's off limits. Now these public resource lands are treated in a way that is sort of, biodiversity concerns just will not come in because they're extremely difficult to even get hold of any public land to begin with. So it's impossible. The only way that it can work is if they were built into the, into the PPAs and the structures, the actual sort of agreements that you make with those plants. So what's happening is it's pitting two things against each other aside from just the ones you were talking about. Local communities are pastoral in those areas. So they will move back and forth, and quite aside from just the birds, it's the communities too who will come only in certain times and certain places. So they end up getting blocked off entirely. That's not something you can build in resiliently into the grid infrastructure. It's not something you can do. And the companies are all public owned, they're not private. For that kind of a situation, what would you recommend? Are there guidelines which the EU or other contexts give us for it? Is there something that you all have come across that could be useful for those who are working in those contexts? Basically just to rub heads on that issue.
Thank you very much. We have a bunch of different topics, and I think we start with Jörg, especially what is the coin that we should ask for project developers? It's not dollars, it's objective, but what do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, that is again the discussion around how come we from paper to implementation in nature. Since paper is useless sometimes and even money is not always helpful if nothing has happened with the money. And what I think is we should come to an agreement, the other way around. I see the energy system as a new land use system, and that means we should have a kind of good common practice. And we have to define that. And for me, these are parts of the good common practice. And in other land use systems in Europe, in forestry and agriculture, for example, the legislation is referring to these kind of technical standard. And that would be a task for the industry as well, to come up with a suggestion or with a voice in the discussion about the kind of good common practice as a technical guideline, which can be referred by the legislation then. And there is then the link to say it is good common practice that it has to be implemented within 6 months, a year or something. So a reasonable time frame for that. It is, I guess, not to manage if you really have it directly in a legislation, so that it's maybe too unflexible for all the different kinds of situations where you have to deal with these questions. That would be my recommendation.
And Rob, maybe you can add to this.
Yeah, happy to. Sorry, I missed your name. The microphone went quiet, but it was a great question. I maybe it wasn't as clear as I might have been when I was describing certainly what my company does. Certainly it's got nothing to do with just paying cash. That's not what we do. What we have is a methodology that's agreed with environment agencies. It sets out, you get credits for doing certain things. So if you put wetlands in, that gives you so many credits. If you put, I don't know, trees in, it gives you so many credits. And obviously you have to hit the benchmark by doing physical things on the ground. It's not about paying some money into a fund and going away. And similarly, the tree planting we do with this charity, and we physically plant trees. We don't just give money to people. That's not what we're interested in doing. And I agree that you're right to be sceptical about that, because the track record of those sorts of things isn't great. Just to comment on a couple of the other things, if that's helpful. I just think the example in Georgia of the court case, it's easier said than done. But I think if once things get to court, it's very difficult. It's almost like there are no winners. I once had a legal director who said, by definition, when you get to court, 50% of the legal advice was wrong because someone loses. So I think, to me, it's much more about how can we get a mature conversation so we don't get that. Sometimes it happens in life that we have to go to court, but how can we best avoid that? And to the example for Pakistan, I couldn't comment on all of the detail there, but I do wonder whether that's an example of this point we did discuss about if there are too many detailed rules, you get those unintended consequences and things, and maybe we've got to challenge the rules if that's possible. Would be the only, probably not very good, but the best thought I've got.
I just want to add one example so that we can come to an end with a positive understanding. In Germany, we had for decades the fight with the extractive industry, soil and stones and all the things. And what we developed in the last years is really this kind of industry standard how to manage the sites in a biodiversity-friendly way. And they are doing that with such a passion and with so much money and with so much involvement that we are impressed by the success for the biodiversity, and they do it much better than all the official authorities. So if we are able to develop that, especially for solar parks, and then in a second step for the more complex questions around wind farms, I think then we would be on a good way. And it's possible.
And now to me the easy questions, right? No, I really wanted to thank you both for the examples on Georgia and Pakistan, because this is what we come across very, very often. And I cannot go into the details, but EBRD, you mentioned EBRD. EBRD is quite engaged in the Energy Task Force. And what we usually get, without knowing exactly the details there, as he mentioned, once you get into court, maybe it's too late. Timing, it's really essential for them, because what happens usually with investment banks is that they are humans like everybody else, and they have a very small time frame where they have to provide advice to the government and to their superiors on whether or not that funding should happen or not. And we are talking about sometimes 15 days for a massive development that they need to do their best to gather their information. And sometimes simply they don't have this information because the issues that we mentioned before. I've seen cases where investment banks have pulled out. They knew later and they recommended, not to invest. But some of the time they could not do it because they didn't have the data. And then you enter a different debate. You enter the court case or you enter a compensation situation, which is let's say, is suboptimal. And this is why the Energy Task Force really makes a lot of effort on providing the information before and sharing best practice. Then it becomes a different scenario, But I think that my experience is that investment banks are the most interested in avoiding these scenarios. We should talk about differently from private, or let's say sovereign banks, which are a bit different. But investment banks really, they do obey with World Bank guidance for environmental impact assessment, and they are quite tough on that when they have the information. And for Pakistan, again, easy to be said, but I think this is the typical case of a strategic planning, strategic environmental planning. There are many cases where governments will use their public land as the priority for renewable energy for many different reasons. If they do have enough, again, time and capacity, sometimes it's a problem of capacity building, to develop a really good strategic environmental assessment and a strategic environmental strategy for their whole country, they will be prepared. Sometimes what happens is that they are not prepared, let's put it this way, and the investment comes in and the pressure is quite big, and public land is the low-hanging fruit that they can use, but then it raises a lot of conflicts with local populations, local communities, biodiversity, etc. So again, it's a problem of timing. There is no easy solution once the issue is on the table. What we are trying to do is to work with the parties before that, so they know how to develop a strategy. So they do sensitivity mapping, they do take into account cumulative impact assessments, they know how to prioritize these habitats against the others, they do know how to compensate for specific habitat cases. but I mean, it takes time. I'm not saying that it's easy to do from one day to the other.
So I think we have come to the end of our session. I would like to add that adding sustainability criteria to especially financing for an investment bank is absolutely important. And getting some standards on what level of sustainability criteria should be added, I think it's urgently needed, because very often a lot of actors translate sustainability exclusively as carbon reduction. And of course, that's not what we want. I want to thank the panelists and you. We are the last event of the day, so to say. Definitely, tackling these issues requires a lot of time. You mentioned if the countries have capacity building, staffing, authorities is a fundamental requirement across the world, not just in developing countries. We see this in Europe as much as anywhere else. And I would like to conclude that if we fail to build renewable energy, wind and solar and electricity grids, we as a default are going to have gas and coal and nuclear. And they also come with their own impact. So we need to find really the space to bring actors together and find the solution for renewable energies and electricity grids. Otherwise, we will stay with what we have and add much more. And with this, I thank you all and wish you a nice evening. Bye.